capitalism at its extreme, like we are living today, is not a solution. Milton Friedman, neoliberal economic, to say the role of business is only to make profit for the shareholders, that should be banned. That's like, we know it doesn't work.
Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, a podcast about the business of doing good. I'm Charlie Martin, your host and founder of TrueMark, the mark of trusted sustainability reports and communications. And our article this week is titled, Where Does the World Stand on ISSB Adoption? Written by Jennifer Laidlaw for S&P Global in May 2026, it tracks how dozens of countries are adopting the ISSB's global sustainability standards, but each one is tweaking, delaying, or diverging from them in its own way. And I'm absolutely delighted to say, joining me from Canada today is an absolute expert in this area. I'm joined by Charles Cho, an expert in sustainability accounting and corporate reporting standards. He's Professor of Sustainability Accounting at Schulich School of Business and a member of the Global Reporting Initiative's Global Sustainability Standards Board. He's also the editor of Accounting Forum. Charles, it's absolutely fantastic to have you on the show today. Thank you for giving up some of your time.
It is a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Charlie.
As somebody who obviously is nowhere near as educated as you are on these things, I have to admit, when I read this article, I was saddened in many ways, because I thought to myself, with such good intent of creating that kind of single global standard when it comes to sustainability reporting, it feels like with many things, it's just been sort of manipulated and watered down and diverged, and the whole thing's diverged from its original kind of intention. Charles, can you just touch on that for me, and perhaps just give our listeners and viewers a little bit more context around what the article covers?
Sure. First of all, thank you for finding this article. I read obviously a lot of things about sustainability reporting standards, because, as you said, there's a lot of things going on as we speak even. But I did find this article, which I didn't know about. Thank you again for sharing it. But I find it very comprehensive and up-to-date. I was quite impressed by the breadth and the nature for how sustainability reporting standard and the ISSB has come through. It's very detailed. It's very comprehensive. So again, thank you for finding it. I use it for my teaching on my own knowledge. But I mean, okay, so I knew, most of these things happening, but not everything. As I said, it's very difficult to keep up these days. I do find the information about each country, what they do specifically, quite useful. I think for somebody who is not well versed in this area, it could be slightly technical. Because, but I guess the audience coming from this S&P website is also kind of quite well versed in business, finance, accounting, and investment type of issues. So I found this article very well. I think it's mostly accurate. It is accurate. I won't go into the details for each country because everybody can read it. So it is a form of ISSB adoption of where it has been more successful than others. It shows a difference between voluntary and mandatory. And they just compare the standards to the European standards, the EFRAG standards as well. One of my first comments, and being you mentioned in your kind introduction of myself of a member of GSSB, is that there was no mention of that. And to me, that is one of the biggest things that jumped at me. And I'm not saying because I'm a member of GSSB, but even overall, you cannot ignore what's going on the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative side. Also knowing that it is the oldest and the most established, still to date, standard setter in sustainability in the world. So for this article I don't know if it's deliberate or not, to have omitted that was a little bit surprising to me, because there is some tension between what GSSB does and ISSB does. So that's kind of what my first kind of remark would be.
That was going to be, Charles, I love the fact that you picked that up, because that was almost going to be I guess one of my first questions, and just talk us through that tension if possible. And for those that aren't aware of it, can you just give us a little bit of a background on what the GRI actually does?
Sure. So I'm going to be brief here. In the late 90s, there is this organization, not-for-profit organization, that was established called the Global Reporting Initiative, which was basically a multi-stakeholder-based approach to reporting for non-financial and, I guess now, sustainable reporting standards. So 1997, that's a long time ago, almost 30 years ago. GRI, I use that acronym now. GRI has been, standards have been widely used across the world. It remains a voluntary standard, but yet it's a very comprehensive standard. The most important thing is that it has focus on impact reporting, which is reporting on the matters of issues of companies towards the world. So what is the impact of business operations and anything business activities on society and environment and the planet? On the other hand, to jump a little bit ahead, the ISSB, which is a board created by this organization called this IFRS Foundation, very powerful and resourceful, which oversees also the International Accounting Standard Board, the Financial Accounting Standard Board, has been created very recently in 2022 after some consultation. And the attention comes from that, unsurprisingly, because they are financially oriented, they come from a financial materiality perspective reporting, which is basically how is the climate and how is the environment affect the company only, right? So you can see that it's a very different type of reporting when you ask company to report on what are you doing to address the issue that you are causing to the planet versus what are you doing about the issues that the planet is creating on your business, which is investor focus. So here is a very 2 minutes tension, very opposing view of the type of reporting that the two boards are setting as standards.
And for somebody like myself, who sort of probably has a dangerous level of knowledge when it comes to this sort of thing, it just feels to me like can't we knock heads together and find ways of truly coming up with a singular standard that factors in all of these nuances? And it seems kind of petty in a way that we've got these multiple standards that are trying to do very similar things, but from a sort of a slightly different perspective. Is that a view that you broadly share, or do you think that kind of nuance and differentiation between these standards is needed for a kind of a complex world that we live in?
I mean, there's no doubt that those two standard perspectives I just described are complementary rather than competing. There has been some discussion, more tense than others, that, put them as a competition, the ISSB versus the GSSB, which, to be honest, I was kind of a little bit, biased and say, well, what investors focus ISSB is doing is not helping the planet. And I still believe that. However, I do admit that we need to also, address investor issues. So what brilliantly happened in the meantime in this timeline is this European standard setter has come up with a comprehensive, even more comprehensive standard that addresses both sides, the CSRD, which is the directive, the law that get into it. The beauty of it being mandatory for European firms under certain scope, but it captures what we call double materiality. Okay, so the article touches on that because they do talk about the European standards. They do compare it to the ISSB. So the article speaks kind of about that. And I believe that, to me, the European standards is kind of the golden standards because it addresses both impact materiality and financial materiality. The two tension that I just described are kind of captured in the European standards. On the other hand, I would also think that if a company is going to use one or the other, the GRI standards or the ISSB standards, nothing really prevents them to adapt both at the same time, which would, in a sense, become double materiality, and it will address a lot of problems. The problem is when it's a power game, and I'll get into that later, it becomes a little political. They say, you use my standards because we are the best one. But are they the best one for the planet? Are they the best one for the society? Are they the best one for the multiple stakeholders around the world? That is the big question we have to ask.
Charles, you've described it, and again, adding in CSRD to the mix as well. So, essentially we have, from your perspective, CSRD is the most complete standard because it factors in sort of both sides of the coin, from the ISSB and from the GRI standards. So from that point of view, is that the future that something like CSRD will be globally adopted, or is that sort of pie in the sky thinking that's where we're heading?
Absolutely. I'm a proponent of the CSRD, and to be more precise, the standard is the ESRS. I'm sorry to throw acronyms. ESRS standing for European Sustainability Reporting Standards. It's not rocket science, but we have to say it. So these European standards are, to me, as I repeat, they're gold because they capture double materiality. They're good. And I think if everybody could follow ESRS under CSRD, it'll be great. Now, the problem within Europe is that they had, one good thing was they had mandated it as a law, which is huge, which is really, really impressive. But then they backed down on the scope of which companies should be. So it started with certain threshold, and then it got reduced significantly up to 80% of companies no longer have to follow that. And that happened after the regulation came out last year. And it was called omnibus, by the way, just as a term. When you back down on the law and you make amendments to the law after you put it. And that didn't look good. So even within Europe, it's a bit of a political mess. And so the standard itself, the principles are great. But the way that it's being implemented, politicized, abused, misused, is also sad to see.
I want to come back to the optimism in the sort of later half of our conversation, but just striking on the kind of why is this happening for now? You mentioned the watering down of standards. Why does that happen? Is it just simply that we've got lobbyists out there that are saying this looks like a hell of a lot of work that we don't really want to commit to? And
well, you said it. It's a burden for companies to report on these issues, especially when it comes down to impact materiality, where they have to find reporting data to say how much we are damaging the world, basically, right? What are the impact that we are making? And usually they are pretty negative impacts. So they don't want to do that. Okay. Not only that doesn't help them, but it's a lot of work. So it's burdensome. So the argument comes down from, hey, why we should report this because blah, blah, blah. Then politics got involved. As you say, lobbying gets involved. This is purely about lobbying, the government, because EU, for example, is a public institution, government institution. So you had jurisdiction, I won't name the countries, but some powerful jurisdiction who just say, hey, wait a minute, this regulation is a little bit tough on us. Why don't we simplify it? Why do we reduce the scope of companies to be included? And that's sad to see, because you can clearly see that the companies are there to just, get the pragmatic, short-term profit-oriented mindset and don't want to deal with this extra reporting, which is actually very helpful for the world, but they don't want to do that. So that's kind of what happens in the standard setting world. There's one word for it: political.
What do you see as the sort of the optimistic points, or the optimism, if you like, that you have for reporting around sustainability moving forward? Where are they? What are they?
Well, I would have said, and I still believe, a mandated regulation as strict is like you stick or the carrot, right? So the carrot usually does not really work in capitalist system. So usually it's a stick. So the stick was, and still is, the regulation, like mandatory reporting. And I would insist with enforcement, because you can mandate everything you want. If you don't enforce it, that means to me, it remains voluntary. But then we saw what happens with the European Union. That was very interesting to see that even when you mandate things and you regulate things, there are some powerful parties who are able to, influence that regulation on their favor, right? So this is a bit of a problem. I know it doesn't make it more optimistic, but unfortunately the system is built that, more money, more power gets you away from these reporting requirements, which are again burdensome. So for me, the optimism is not necessarily from the reporting per se. I mean, reporting is important, is to find ways to have companies, find different business model. I mean, we talk about business cases Okay, so if you do things more sustainably, you're going to save money. Okay, except that also implies that, okay, then we do more business and then we do more damage to the world. So we have to find the right balance between what is good for society and what is good for the shareholders. My optimism in general over this whole state of the world, as an academic, as a professor, as an educator, is education. Exactly. It's to try to, in a business school, to teach them that, capitalism at its extreme, like we are living today, is not a solution. Milton Friedman, neoliberal economic, to say the role of business is only to make profit for the shareholders, that should be banned. That's like, we know it doesn't work, okay, because it does more damage to the world than before. So these are the things that I'm trying to, ingrain in students, whether they are very young undergraduate students or more experienced MBAs, especially, who have, eventually decision-making powers. I have hope that this type of education did not exist 40 years ago. Now it does, but we just have to do it the right way to try to say, look, we have to have a radical, open your mind, open the box mindset to think creatively, to create things like social enterprise and things to not maximize only financial profit for the shareholders and take care of stakeholders and the environment. That should be in all business management textbooks today.
What are people receptive to these new ideas generally? Is this something that is on the agenda for those that you're working with?
So it is I am lucky and privileged to teach in a university and a business school especially that has a DNA or a culture that is kind of aligned with mine, which is obviously why I joined, right? So the students in our classes in general are very open-minded and they're very progressive-minded in terms of challenging the status quo and do things differently. So except for when you teach mandatory course on sustainability, which we do, and you will always have some students who will be more reluctant, but that remains still a minority. Students are very receptive to that. They are sometimes even more critical than sometimes what I teach them or what I have them read in the projects. For example, I do these projects on what I call a silent shadow account social audit, basically detecting greenwashing, right? I give them a report to read, to analyze in depth for the semester, and they have to find sources, to document that what this company is saying, whether it is true or not, based on other facts, outside sources. And they always come back totally shocked. They usually choose their company and come like, they're a bunch of greenwasher. I'm not going to purchase from them anymore.
It's fascinating. And I think it's such a good thing to, we hear so much in the modern world about, the lack of capacity that young people in particular have for debate and discussion and to have discourse with people that maybe have different views and different perspectives of their own. It's fantastic that you're kind of addressing that. I know within this particular subject area, but you're addressing that within the conversation you're having with your students. But I just want to draw this back slightly before we get to your magic wand, to reporting standards. To your point, like the system, the incentives, etc., are set. They are what they are currently. And yes, I totally agree with you that we need a fundamental rethink about how we incentivize organizations and companies around the world. And we need to do it collectively. But what would happen within the current system if one of these standards, whether or not it be the ISSB, whether or not it be the CSRD in its sort of more applied form across the world, what would happen if we did get a truly globally recognized and implemented sustainability reporting standard? Like what happens on day one if that is embedded and in place? Like what are the implications of it?
Well, it's going to be a bit radical what I'm going to say, but we can have still the best sustainability reporting standard, as I mentioned, something like ESRS, let's say, but I still think that would not be the end of it. That's not enough. Because at the end of the day, when you take a bit of a step back, and I'm in the reporting, say I'm an accounting professor, I studied this. We are so into the tree, we don't see the forest, right? So we're inside. We think we fight over reporting standard, which is ridiculous, right? We are fighting over which reporting standard, not action. Reporting standards are the best, but we are far away from actual performance and action. And so sadly, even if we put the best standards, that's great to make companies more accountable, which is really the main purpose of reporting, make them more accountable. But in terms of, as we mentioned about production line and doing business and action, I'm not sure that reporting standards is going to help a lot.
I think even just hearing, reflecting on, this conversation today, it's, well, what would be one of the ways that the incumbents, the status quo would look to sort of maintain that as much as they possibly can? Well, create a distraction over here around standards of reporting and produce as much white noise as you possibly can around what good looks like and what a globally recognized standard looks like, and the fact that we need to work on that. And that still then allows everybody just to carry on doing what they're doing whilst that conversation's going on. So to your point, I can see that this is just another lever that those that are happy with how things are, they're utilizing it in that way. Charles, let's conclude now. I have to admit, we've had a slightly more pessimistic look at reporting standards than I had anticipated. But I want to hear now, and I think I know where you're going to go with this, what you would do with your magic wand. So, Charles, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Well, there's no surprise, as you said. I would change the capitalist system. I would change how the incentives are designed, everything about organizations that we have today. And I know it's a lot of things, but that one package of the role of the business in the role of business in society, I would change maybe the system itself. If I can't, I would change the law or the regulation around it and stay away from the lobbying. And
would it be that from a law perspective, the key would be that it would be a globally acknowledged and ratified law, something that is a collective stance on the way that organizations are incentivized? That's the key.
That's the key. And I think that some countries are a little bit more advanced and better than others. This fiduciary duty kind of thing that we rely on, that is so old, about who have a duty to the shareholders to make maximum profits. Well, that tends to kind of be not disappearing, but fading away and adding the social and environmental. So there is hope in the type of organizations, such as big corporations and other social enterprise, as I mentioned. But I would like that to be applied, across the world for sure. That's not just one country. As I said, there were some disparities across the world, that some countries are doing better than others because of the political system, right? The political environment that business and society operate in.
And out of interest, Charles, just to finish on that, what are, so that our listeners and viewers can go and dig a little deeper, what are the countries that are, doing particularly well in this area?
Well, not surprisingly, some of the European countries, not all, but I think Europe has always been, socially progressive in general, although because of political, again, it's kind of mixed with some of the movement that's happening, but in general, and this is also illustrated by why the standards are from Europe. But I would also say that in Asian countries, for example, in countries like even Korea, Japan, or even developing countries like Southeast Asia, I think there is a higher conscience about, even though they should worry about what they're going to eat tomorrow because, they're not doing so well, but there is a mindset of, people first rather than profit kind of thing. I mean, this is just my global view, and I'm not saying that because I'm from Asian descent, but I've seen that, and I've seen also, believe it or not, in African countries too, and surprisingly, they should worry about profit maximization, but it's not as clear as you think. So I think they are concerned. They are the victims of climate issues that caused by the global northwestern world as well. And the resilience in those countries, sometimes I observe, I cannot generalize, but from my point of view, impresses me. And even as an educator, I'm lucky to be able to go give talks and seminars, guest lectures, interact with students. There is that hope So,
Charles, I love the fact that you managed to finish it on a hopeful position. It's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me. I know that was a whistle-stop tour through the article and the themes related, but that was really interesting. And I certainly, for one, have learned a great deal more about standards and how they fit into the bigger picture. So thank you for sharing that with me.
great. Thank you for having me. A pleasure.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thanks to Charles Cho for joining me on today's show. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trusted sustainability reports and communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.